Struck right here on Riot Radio. I'm your host Ryan, and today we're going to be talking about the four souls. So this is a concept that is actually derived from Shinto philosophy and Shinto belief system, which is a Japanese tradition that was practiced in the older days of Japanese kind of concept of spirituality. And now it is still practiced, but it's practiced less so. But we see it a lot showing up in times of anime appearances almost, such as a series Inuyasha. We won't go to any of that stuff yet. We'll kind of get into drawing the example to that a bit later. But first we're going to start off just talking about what is this concept of the four souls and how do they relate to how we operate in the world. And I think that when we understand that everything in creation almost operates similar to a orchestra or a symphony or something that is akin to how music operates, where things are in harmony, are going to be expressed and shown to be more beautiful or well expressed, let's say, then you kind of get an overall understanding of how to apply that stuff back to just life in general and to your own personal philosophy. So going into the four souls, maybe we'll pull up the picture actually just in the right hand corner, and or maybe it's in the left hand corner. Essentially there's these four aspects that govern this concept of what they call as Naobi when the four souls are energized in harmony. So Shikou Mitama is this overall concept of the four souls. So you have Aramitama, and then Nigimitama, Kushimitama, and Sakimitama. So Aramitama is courage, Nigimitama is friendship, Kushimitama is wisdom, and Sakimitama is love. And all of these are basically aspects of these four souls that are then combined within the human heart and stored there in this spiritual essence state. And when they're in harmony, they energize good and purity and love and light. But when they're out of balance, they represent almost this corrupted or evil aspect that is almost this impure or defiled state, right? So this is a pretty interesting concept that these four aspects are so fundamental to an individual and how they operate and move through the world, especially in a sense where you have these concepts which are not physical in nature per se, because though they relate to certain concepts of the individual, such as action or states of applied wisdom or whatnot, they're not really tangible per se. You almost have to sense it to a degree inside of you, and you kind of have to make those judgments based on the objective view and information that you have when the situation is transpiring. So it kind of comes back to that concept that a lot of spiritualists talk about when they say the world is a reflection of you. There, signs going off. Oh boy. Oh well, a malfunctioning sign is oh, there we go. Well, okay, went off again. Anyway, I'll probably come back, but the concept essentially is that when you have these four souls in harmony, they're typically creating this balance that a human being or individual seeks to attain within themselves, which is this overall state of equilibrium where everything is in somewhat of a harmonious flow or harmonious state of expression. And the reason why this is kind of pivotal to the human state of being as a whole is really that we're kind of governed by a mix of different aspects in life, not just what we experience, but what we do with the wisdom that we derive from that experience, how we take action in those experiences. And all of these concepts are really part of the same thing, which is the aspect that makes up your identity, but they're ultimately governed by this force outside the self, which is also part of the environment. So when you start to kind of culminate this view inside the self of being that reflection that you want to see in the world, then these souls can be in harmony and they can energize that energy of being in a state of purity or being in a state with balance with the outside world, right? When that does not happen, this is like clockwork here. This thing's going off again. I mean, I guess it's kind of, I don't know, traditional to how neon signs or whatever would look like. You know, they typically have electrical issues and they go on and off. But I mean, that's kind of the lore behind them. But anyway, going back to the four souls, essentially, almost like when you have that state of harmony or balance within, then things can manifest that as a reflection of that energy. But when you represent the aspects that are not aligned with that, such as, say, Aramitama, courage becomes cruelty, or other aspects where, you know, perhaps you use the other aspects of the four souls for things such as manipulation, or, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost to make appearances seem a way they're not. So to have a facade or something like that, something of that nature. That's almost this energy of manipulating circumstance to get what you want, even though that both of these might in some sense create the same effect or the same goal. The way you get there is not the same, and therefore the end result that you get with each is going to differ slightly, right? So in this case, when we're talking about these aspects of creation really leading to how a human being is reflected in their outside experience, you really want to make sure that you're not almost trying to find some kind of expedient route, because the only route is through almost honesty with yourself and knowing thyself, right? So understanding that the reflection that's inside you is almost what should primarily be understood before even attempting to add in other pieces of the puzzle is kind of imperative to you getting this whole encompassed picture, right? Because if the image or reflection that is inside you is not clear, then you lack almost like a clear, how should we say, a clear reflection in the pond, or clear reflection in the water. So that's pretty much what I got for you just around that analogy. And maybe I'll yeah, the sign is doing its own thing today. So okay, there. See, it's back again. I'll show you guys this little analogy I drew out. And it's pretty much just representing how human consciousness, we could leave the pictures and stuff up. It's fine. So I'll bring it this side. So essentially what we have here is one experience where, see this one where there's no lines in the water? You have essentially this concept to where you're in a purely objective view of reality. And the other one is where you're projecting some kind of thought form or some kind of experience onto an event. So to see, it went off again. Yeah, I don't know. That is doing its own thing, so I should manifest it to come back or something like that. But essentially you have these two concepts where you have almost these two ponds, and in one pond ripples form, and in one pond ripples don't form. And essentially what you're getting here is two pathways of going about life, and one is projected off a subjective circumstance which you then repeat onto your future experience, and the other is where you maintain an objective point of view and you don't create a memory or a preconceived notion about that event that you will take with you moving forward. And even if you have preconceived notions about something, you can drop it by maintaining that state of objectivity within the self and noticing kind of anything that comes up in relation to that. So essentially, that is the concept I had for you about causality and how these things come into play. And maybe we'll go to now actually the picture of the four souls from, or the picture of the Shikou jewel from Inuyasha. And here we could see, like, in the series Inuyasha, they talk about the jewel, and they talk about it representing the combination of these four aspects of the soul. Again, Aramitama, Nigimitama, Kushimitama, and Sakimitama, representing courage, friendship, wisdom, and love. And essentially, when these are out of balance, the jewel becomes defiled and it has a, malevolent energy around it. And you can kind of see that embodied in Naraku, which is the villain of the series. So essentially, this is drawing a parallel to this concept of the state of things being in a modality of not built off some kind of firm state of being, or built off a foundation which is clear and which is actually stable, will cause things to always break down and almost continue the state of regeneration and constant battle and dematerializing of the self and then rematerializing, almost this everlasting state of rebirth, or this everlasting state of destruction, and then things forming from that energy. So it's really this type of energy that is always kind of breaking down or not sustained on some aspect of the self. In contrast, some of the other characters you see in the series, the priestesses and whatnot, who are kind of aligned with this aspect, are the ones who end up purifying the jewel or getting the jewel into a more purified state. When the jewel is in the state that it's in now, or it's kind of defiled or whatever, you are essentially having those aspects of yourself that are now amplified by this object, projecting or manifesting that energy onto the reality. So it's almost similar to the thing that I drew with this, the analogy that I draw here, which is almost like you can consider like this, somebody who has like maintained a state of spiritual evolution or enlightenment of self, where one can maintain an objective viewpoint on how reality operates and maintain a state of purity within, where they're not kind of thrown off by outside circumstance, or they're not severely afflicted because they are accustomed to this type of circumstance or type of energy unfolding around them, and them having a clear reflection of the self allows them to almost see into this clear pond of water without ripples disturbing the image. In this other scenario on the left, where the person's heart is almost it's corrupted, or it has a part to it which is impure or defiled, then that is also projected onto the outside circumstance, because that person has parts within them which are not purified or not expressed through that certain avenue of being. Yeah, I needed to drink some tea there. So maybe we'll go to the image of the purified jewel now, actually. And today I'm trying not to structure things too much. I'm trying just to kind of get a lot of information in, rather than tie it down to us just talking about this one concept without relating it to, the influence of the heart, or, the influence of any of these other aspects of spirituality, because just talking about one thing might end up kind of tedious or boring or whatever. But for example, like relating this concept back to the Egyptian analogy, or the Egyptian view of the afterlife, where they have the scales essentially balancing each other out, and that dictating whether you're going to be admitted into the afterlife or not. This is essentially the same kind of concept, where the balance within yourself must be in a state where both the scales are evened out, because when they are, then you can operate with a state of clarity of being. And when they're not in balance, then, well, they're not in balance, then you're going to have one side with more energy than the other, and it's going to create almost these ripples or waves. And that's just the nature of reality, kind of. If you think about it, energy always has to go somewhere, and it can maintain a state of calm potential, or it can be expressed in all sorts of different ways, or it's chaotic and unstructured and whatnot. So that is also a possibility. But when we talk about the jewel, especially in these concepts where, it's either in a defiled state or impure, corrupted state, or it's in a pure state where it's essentially free of all malevolent energy, or it's energizing, purified, or good energy, is essentially dependent on the practitioner. But this never-ending cycle of light and dark, or this battle going on inside the jewel. And in the lore of the show, that's essentially what is really being depicted, because the whole lore in the show of the jewel is that the demons are sealed within the jewel, and the priestess Midoriko is also sealed within the jewel. And these two forces of energy, one represented by the purity of the soul, that's the priestess, and the impurities of the soul, that's the demons, are just battling each other out in eternal battle inside the jewel. So the jewel is almost this solidified state of never-ending expressed battle and conflict between these two polar forces inside this sacred object. And that's why the jewel is so desired by all who are corrupt, essentially, because this is representational of a state of being in which an individual can either use it for selfless purposes or selfish purposes, and by choosing either of those paths, that will express how not only the wish that is made on the jewel will be expressed, but it will also affect the reality that transforms around the jewel, such as you see with Naraku, like, his castle is always essentially overflowing or covered by miasma, which is essentially this cloud of demonic or negative energy, which is essentially toxic to all the beings who oppose it, who are not of that same demon nature or caliber, such as Shishomaru or any of these other guys, right? Like Shishomaru actually is probably one of the few characters who actually is not affected by that, just because he's such a high caliber level of demon where that kind of stuff is not even relevant to him. So that is essentially the concept relating to the jewel in terms of this never-ending cycle. But in relation to, like, this pond and let's say I want to draw this analogy that I've actually made recently throughout the day, and maybe this will be on me to kind of elaborate this the best I can. But essentially, if I have this marker, or I pick up this marker for the first time, right, and it falls out of my hands, and I say, oh, well, this marker must be slippery because it slipped out of my hands, whatever. I'm creating a preconceived notion about my experience with that for a future point in time or a future time period. I've created a memory of that being slippery or that slipping out of my hand or whatever, right? In this reality, I drop it, falls out of my hand, and I just pick it up as if nothing happened, and there's no disconnecting consciousness or action from me dropping it and picking it up. So I don't form that process of, oh yeah, it easily slipped out of my hand, or it's slippery or whatever. I'm operating from pure objectivity of just, pick it up just as I normally would, right? Almost as if you were doing it for the first time. But when you pick it up, like in the first analogy, and you drop and you say it's slippery or whatever, then essentially you are creating a preconceived notion of how that event will play out in the future, which is not actually the reality of how that event is playing out. So essentially what this means is you are projecting your past circumstances onto the future, which will create the same result because you want that same result to occur at some subconscious level. Maybe you don't want it to occur, but you expect it to occur, so it does. And expectation and reality are pretty interlinked if you think about it, because you are essentially as big as you can think. So if your state of imagination is limited, your state of essentially being a conscious being of spiritual energy or magical energy is essentially limited also. And this is what Einstein was talking about. He was saying like imagination is leaps and bounds more important and more significant to being a human being or an individual or a spiritual being than anything that is concrete in science. He used to run thought experiments with being on a wave of light, or doing his thought experiments where he'd hold the ball in his hand, and when he drop it, he'd wake up and he'd try to get into that state of theta so he could contemplate his theory. So when we're talking about abstract ideas like this of the mind, where we're talking about initially both coming from a state of pure objective awareness, but one that is now focused on an event that has happened, and one that is actually focused on an event as it's unfolding, is different, because when you're in the objective viewpoint, then you can be aware of what's happening in this situation. Let's take a similar situation. Let's say, like I'm in the present moment, whatever is happening, the paper just happens to fall out of my hand, but I catch it just like that. That's me being reactive to the information, or being in flow with the information in the present circumstance. But if I'm not in that state of objectivity, if I'm not in that state of flow, then essentially you create these ripples in reality, and that is then projected onto the future circumstance, which will repeat that same causality or that same loop or that same result that you had. You will create it once again because you have an imprint of it being that way, or you have a impression of that being a factor, right? But if you were to wipe the slate clean and say, let me live my life as if it just started from this moment in time, just started from this moment in time, just started from this moment in time, then you are essentially saying that I don't want to replay the same program anymore. That program it's not useful. I want to play a new program, or I want to put in some kind of new circumstance which I can then express. I want to have an objective viewpoint so I can start over. And that is almost the whole causality of how memories are created and why we repeat patterns in life. And it's almost this cycle of what they would refer to as fate, right? So the cycle of fate is almost what Naraku also references in the show, that essentially this never-ending cycle or this never-ending battle of fate is always going on, where you have this like thread that is constantly always spinning. And yeah, I don't get why this is like not working, but anyway, it is what it is at the end of the day. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how many times I'll have to change the batteries in that thing for it to work, but so too is the nature of the show today. Anyway, moving on. Let's go on to Kikyo. Let's pull up the image of Kikyo. All right. So there we got the priestess in all her majesty, with the jewel, obviously, that she has been able to purify with her spiritual powers. And essentially, when we're talking about that state, we're essentially talking about we're essentially talking about this state over here. We're talking about the one where the water is clear, where that is a clear reflection of what is in our soul, what is in our spirit, what is in our being, what is in the combination of the four souls. And over here, you have the expression of almost like an oraku or whoever who would not have the ability to purify the jewel in that sense, right? So Kikyo really represents this priestess who is capable of this immense spiritual power and ability to purify this sacred object and keep it in a state where the demon energy is not overpowering the energy and spilling into the environment. So again, you have this cycle where it's almost like they're locked in never-ending battle of light and dark, where again, my artistic skills are not the best, but you know, just you really have these two aspects of the same state of being, which is one represented and expressed through purity of energy, and one represented through, good enough, the yin-yang. So you have these two energies which are essentially the same, come from the same force, come from the same potential energy, but they're expressed two different ways. So, you know, you can even relate this to how they talk about, like, you know, the sources of magic, right? You know, tapping into angelic states of being or tapping into demonic or whatever. You're talking about two forces of creation, which are essentially represented through their association with these various creatures in the state of reality that we're referencing, which is in accordance with the jewel. So Shinto philosophy really said that everything, plants, animals, rocks, and, you know, insects, human beings, whatever, they're all created from the four souls. So this energy flows between all things. Even this table is made out of the four souls in some sense, right? So essentially, it's this kind of culmination of these energies which are creating this field around an object, right? And it's a complicated concept to understand, or I should say not uncomplicated. Yeah, it's not uncomplicated, but it's almost there. And I would say that if you can understand essentially what is drawn on this whiteboard with, like, if you can understand what is drawn on this whiteboard in terms of, like, seeing that there are these two different versions of reality which you can live in, one where the objective viewpoint exists and you then acting from that place of objectivity, versus when you act from the place of emotional response and instinct based on past experience, because it's fine to operate on instinct, but operate on instinct that is in alignment with objectivity. Don't act on instinct that is derived from unfiltered emotion, because that can only become useful in very specific circumstances, right? So I would say that in terms of summing this up as a whole, you have one aspect of being where one is corrupted and one is fueled off this malevolent or energy by greed, or associated with the aspect of trying to just take and essentially use power for control, or use it to assert your will, even if it infringes on other energies in the field. And on the other side, you really have this energy of being in a state of purity, or the lack of inability to express oneself properly. And by properly, I just mean in a state where you're not infringing on anybody else's energy, but you are also expressing yourself to the fullest. So that is almost what Kikyo is a representation of in this series. And in the series, we really see Kikyo as this almost guardian force of all the characters, you know, like Naraku at the end. You know, what is it he says? We'll see how courageous you are without Kikyo protecting you. So when he says that, he's really alluding to the fact that all of the characters in this show are really supported by her ability to not only purify the jewel, but energize the force of good, or be representational of that aspect of the priestesses. And sure, this is also embodied in Kagome. You can say that she also has the ability to purify the jewel, but the difference is that Kikyo was a bit more well developed in her abilities as a priestess, because she had already had experience with the jewel. She had already experience with archery and all these aspects of her abilities as a priestess, or her abilities to express oneself in that state of energy. So essentially, we're talking about a concept that it's kind of specific to her. It's specific to her in a sense that not everybody can do that. And even Kagome takes her time to actually realize the full potential of her powers and achieve that state in which she can perform those same acts. And she is very much a priestess in learning, or in training, versus Kikyo, who has been a bit more experienced around this stuff and has protected the jewel for quite some time. So yeah, I mean, the sign has gone off again, but it's just doing its own thing today. But look, the four souls decided to come back a bit into the light of the sign. But anyway, that is essentially the majority of the concept around the four souls, and they're pretty like visually represented in the show by you just being able to see how the characters act and operate and associate with these concepts of courage, friendship, wisdom, and love, because you see it pretty much between all the characters as a result of them almost combating this force of malevolency embodied within Naraku, right? So one way to think about it is that most of the characters in the series only met or only reached that state of being because they were trying to oppose this force of malevolency, which essentially coveted the jewel for that specific purpose, right? And even at the end, you see characters like Sashomaru, who, you know, he is pretty much on the side of the protagonist at the end, where he is also confronting Naraku. And, you know, even you can see with his connection with, like, Rin, for example, how the journey of that process of hunting Naraku or battling against Naraku has changed him as an individual, just through the journey of what he had to go through along the way, and his travels, as well as the lessons he learned through the experiences that he had with not just Rin, but those around him, like Inuyasha, or even Kagome, you can say, right? Like, there have been instances where you've seen him pull off a feat which one would consider as good, but, you know, he would say that it was out of something that was beneficial nature to him, right? Even though we can clearly see the main characters say that, oh yeah, you know, Sashomaru saved me, right? That is kind of the embodiment of the four souls really being represented in this aspect of the energized pure forces of Aramitama, of Nigimitama, of Kushimitama, and of Sakimitama in unity. that essentially these all were individuals who, had some experience happen to them, and through pursuing the jewel, through pursuing Naraku, they all essentially form this almost community or bond with each other, which then represents the other part or purified aspect of the jewel, which is the ones that represent those aspects that I just mentioned. So again, right, you can see, like, with even Naraku, he's a very calculated individual. He's somebody who likes to manipulate others to essentially get what he wants or put a plan into action, which is based around facade or deceit, or trying to lure people into traps or whatever, or illusions, or whatever the thing is, but it's essentially a form of manipulation, right? So that is essentially the essence of the jewel when it's in its impure state. And again, all these concepts relating to this never-ending battle between light and dark, this scale of the heart, which is seen in the Egyptian afterlife, before passing through the halls of Amenti, as Thoth would describe it in the Emerald Tablets. It's I'm just dropping a bit of lore, actually, for if anybody who's very in-depth in these works, they probably are familiar with the Emerald Tablets. But in any case, the point is that this represents an aspect of almost transition between these two forces or two states of being, where you have light on one side, dark on the other, or some kind of contrasting principles, purity and impurity, whatever it is, that expresses how the four souls are expressed in the material world or in the physical realm, play out actually throughout all dimensions, you can think about it, because it does impact the spiritual energy of the environment around it as well. So again, relating it back to all these things which we can then implement into our own life, not uncomplicated, but almost there. And if you can understand this concept of, your consciousness or your objective perspective being imprinted onto a body of water, almost like as if you were somebody actually looking at water, then you won't want to think, what pond do I want to look at? Do I want to look at the pond in which things can be objective and be clear, and I can see a reflection and I can understand what is actually occurring in the environment around me? Or do I want to just rely on the instinct that is associated with a incomplete analysis of information, which usually does not serve you because it's acquired through some kind of default method, such as, memories being created or whatever? And I was having this conversation with somebody earlier, how, it's very interesting, because these can almost be like a double-edged sword, in which, memories can be useful because, you want to be able to learn how to do something most efficiently, right? Like, caveman didn't have to burn himself on fire 1,000 times before he figured out, oh, I bet that hurts if you touch it, right? So on the other hand, you have this kind of aspect where when you apply that to, life, or when you apply that to the energies or the causalities of the world that we have constructed around us, the societal world, that it doesn't always apply that way, because circumstances don't often repeat themselves in the exact same way, because you made a joke and you thought it was funny but nobody laughed. That doesn't mean every time you tell that joke that nobody's going to laugh or whatever. It just means that happened one specific time and that was expressed in that way. But it's not important information to be recorded or for you to base future practice on, right? It's simply something that has transpired and something that should be let go of. And I think that if any person on this planet could ever implement that to its fullest potential, you would see just how easily success can come to you. Because, oh boy, what are they doing over there? You guys are causing a ruckus over there. But essentially, that is the main thing. If you can understand how to implement that as much as you can, you pretty much have like the key of David basically there, right? So, and I think we'll just take that opportunity to sum up with the key of David, where, essentially you do have the key to objectivity, or the key to, the eye of the window of Brahma, as they refer to it in Hindu philosophy, right? The window of Brahma, that is that almost doorway into the pineal gland, or the soul, or objectivity, or whatever you want to call that state of pure essence or pure being. But essentially it's facilitated through almost what they would call, in relation to the Church of Philadelphia, the key of David, the key of objectivity. As they say, the door that openeth and no man closeth, and closeth and no man openeth. So that is what I have for you today, essentially on the concept of the four souls and how they affect your life. But believe me, when these aspects inside of your being are brought into a state of harmony and almost melodic being within yourself, you're going to see just how much the reality around you can transform, right? So I don't think I can explain really any more on this, because we've kind of already hit the nail on the head, just considering what the topics or the concepts that encompass this topic are really representative of. And maybe we'll sum up having the image of Kikyo up on there. So can we get the image? Last one. Yeah. So that has pretty much been the show for today. Just wrapping up the semester here. And, regardless of what happens in the future with me being able to provide you guys this information, I hope you guys do find it useful, because I find that philosophy has been something that has helped me a lot, and deriving it from different sources is important. To draw another anime reference, Uncle Iroh said in The Last Airbender, when you take knowledge from only one place, or when you take wisdom from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. But when you take it from multiple places, when you try to understand others and the other elements, then it can assist you in making yourself whole, or ensuring that you are whole. So will help you become whole. That is how we put it. Anyway, I think that really covers what we had to discuss today, just around this concept of kind of wholeness and the four souls, and how to facilitate that state of being inside the self. And there's no one right path. There's no one right path to whatever your version of enlightenment is, or what other aspects of your individuality you want to pursue. However, I guarantee you that if you can continue to apply a philosophy that is similar to this, in which the imagery is reflective of that objective nature of what is occurring around you, you can continue to advance yourself and make changes as you see fit, right? However, if you cling to the past, or a future result, something that is not currently within your objective viewpoint, or within a state of reality that is actually transpiring, then you will be almost in this state of perpetually always projecting, either past or future emotions onto events around you, which don't actually transpire. So that is what I have for you today on the Four Souls. There's an image of Kikyo, beautiful priestess, and this is pretty much the information I have for you about the purity within one's state of being and within one's heart. So that is pretty much the show today. This has been Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio, discussing the four souls. And again, yeah, we're just summing up the semester, really trying to make sure everything is kind of culminated to some point, because this is not just reflective of this concept, but it's also reflective of, let's say the pyramids of needs we talked about, over the semester. We've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've talked about energy in the field. So these all culminate back to this point of what's really reflected inside the self is also reflected outside the self. And when you understand that, then reality becomes a lot more transparent with you, because to know yourself is to understand the image that is reflected back at you in the mirror. And, that might sound pretty simple, but I do believe that sometimes it is just that straightforward. And if you guys have learned anything today, or anything at any point in the semester of me doing these shows, then I have done my job, because my whole purpose behind doing this is just so I can share what I've learned with you guys, and I think that has been accomplished. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I want to thank the guys behind the scenes, Evan, Eldon, Justin, all you guys who make the show happen. I want to thank everybody for watching, everybody behind the scenes here or watching at home, because you guys help make the show run. So this is me signing off from Moonstruck, and I encourage you to, as always, like, subscribe, and follow us on DC Media Hub. You can add me on Instagram at top_sorcerer, as well as check out my new channel titled The Sword of Mercury. You can find it on YouTube. And yeah, let me know if you enjoyed today's concepts. Check out my other work, and I'll let you guys go. Thanks for watching.